Hello and welcome to Explain Apologetics. We are thrilled to just have completed a major debate, and by we I mean referring to Dr. Randal, Rauser, and myself. We've just completed a debate against Matt Dillahunty and Tom Jump on is there sufficient reasons to believe in God? Uh, that as far as I'm concerned, that took a lot of preparation going into it. And before any further ado, we just thought we'd just do a quick review of how we think the debate went. Joining me to do that is, of course, my teammate in that debate, Dr. Randal Rauser. Pleasure to have you on.
Well, great to be with you, Sam. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for being my debate partner in a rather long debate. I must say, it was almost, I think, 2.5 hours. So it was a full meal deal.
it was a mouthful, and it got a bit heated at times, I must admit. Which is not unusual in debates like this because emotions do tend to get involved. But what I thought we'll do is we'll start from the opening statements, and maybe if you could just share with us what was your intention going into that in your opening statement. What were you trying to accomplish? Because if someone who is an atheist watching that saying, well, you didn't give any evidence at all, uh, how how does your opening statement tie into the topic of the debate?
Yeah. So the issue at hand that we were debating, again, was certainly as I understood it, and I think as you understood it, maybe not as Matt understood it, but it was the issue of the rationality of theism. So could you be rational to believe that God exists? And so I was actually giving an argument for that end. So what I wasn't doing, and this is where I think, yeah, I recognize that some of the audience, if they're not tracking with what the actual debate topic is, just a second. I'm just in the interview, so sorry. Just someone in the kitchen making some noise. So if people are not tracking with the debate topic and they're looking for evidence for God's existence, you don't get that through testimony, through the fact that people believe it based on testimony. But what you get through belief based on testimony is that you could be rational or justified in believing it. And so one problem that we always have to be careful about is special pleading, right? That you're trying to make an exception for your case. So what I wanted to do was say, I'm not making any exception. What I'm doing is appealing to the common fact that testimony provides a properly basic grounds to form a rational belief. And I even extended an olive branch, as it were, and said even atheist parents as well, they can teach their kids. And until their kids have some disconfirming evidence to that testimony, they could be justified. So I was trying to avoid the special pleading charge and show that testimony does widely serve to provide belief in God or justify belief in God.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe for those of us who are not very familiar with what properly basic beliefs are, could you just explain briefly what you mean by that? I know you did in the debate, but just to briefly explain that.
Yes. So there are two kinds of beliefs in terms of how beliefs can be rational or justified. And the one kind is a basic, and then the other kind is non-basic. And a basic belief is a belief that you don't reason to. It's not a conclusion of an argument. It's rather, if you have a particular kind of experience, and then this belief arises as a result of that experience, the experience provides the immediate ground under which you are justified or rational to hold the belief. So for example, if I look out the window and I see that it is raining outside, I immediately form the belief it's raining outside simply because I have a visual presentation of it raining outside. I don't reason to the conclusion, it looks like it's raining outside, therefore it's probably raining, therefore I'll believe it's probably raining. Rather, it's immediate. And so that's basic, and it's properly basic if it's rational. Now, non-basic would be a belief that you reason to or you argue. It's the end of an argument, or it's a conclusion of an argument with premises. So I was arguing for the proper basicality of belief in God, that you don't have to reason to it as the conclusion of an argument.
Yeah, and so for my part, for those of you watching at home, you want to just understand the rationale behind my part. What I wanted to do in this, and of course after much discussion with Dr. Randal, decided that I would approach it from the perspective of religious experience, where you have a universal, almost universal testimony from people that they've experienced God in many ways. And in fact, quite interestingly, I think that Matt Dillahunty in the debate brought out that well, all these testimonies seem to be different from one another, and that's the point. It's independent experiences of God. Now, we're not saying, bear in mind what we're not saying. We're not saying just because you had the testimony that therefore it is true. That's not the argument at all. And it clearly, as I mentioned in my opening statement, it was not the goal to prove God exists. In fact, philosophers who use the argument from religious experience, like Richard Swinburne himself, would deny, for example, the ontological argument and saying that you can't prove God exists, right? So what you're doing is you're basically demonstrating the rationality behind it. And so what I was trying to prove, that it is more reasonable and rational to believe in God's existence, that belief in God's existence was reasonable, or I shouldn't, maybe, because I think the word reasonable was kind of redefined in the debate. It was rational, given the amount of the religious experiences that people face, and maybe that's basically where we came from. I brought out two premises. Premise one, you have people from different eras and different cultures that bear witness to experiencing God. And number two, unless you have evidences to the contrary, it is rational to go ahead and believe what you experience, or on the basis of testimony what someone else experienced, unless you have evidence of deceit or delusion. And if you don't, then it logically follows that you're rational in doing so. So that was the approach I employed going into this debate. But I find it very interesting, Dr. Randal, that Matt brought up the point about the coin flipping, that it's a 50-50 chance, which of course we didn't address because we didn't want to assume that we were trying to argue that God existed, as much as we were trying to argue for the rationality of belief in God. But correct me if I'm wrong, if you have the amount of testimony that we have, we're talking about religious experiences by many different people in the magnitude in which you have, it's not a 50-50 thing anymore. In fact, that ought to add weight to the plausibility of God's existence being true, even though that's not what we were arguing.
Yeah, the excuse me. So 50-50 is, well, his illustration there assumes that the probability of the propositions being true is right at 50%. And of course, I don't think that's the case with theism. In fact, I think that many people will assess the probability of theisms being true differently relative to different data sets. And the point that you were making about the almost universality of religious experience is a very significant one that I don't think they're really grappling with. One interesting moment in the debate, I don't know if you picked up on this, that Matt referenced the Piraha. Are you familiar with them?
No, I was not. That's why I didn't follow up.
Okay, so the Piraha, they're a tribe of indigenous people living in Latin America or South America, and there was a book written about them by a former missionary who went to convert them to Christianity. And he discovered that they appeared to have no sense of God at all. They didn't have, in Romans 2, it talks about the light given to every person. Romans 1 talks about sort of a general revelation to all people. And the Piraha seemed not to have that, to have no belief in God at all. And so that was the reason that this guy ultimately deconverted from Christianity and became an atheist. But to my mind, that doesn't create, that's an interesting question. What do you do with the Piraha in particular? But the way I look at that kind of case is that it actually shows how widespread theism really is. To find a culture in which theism is not the widespread, if not predominant or universal view, you have to go to one little tribe in South America. And that just shows us how ubiquitous, how universal religious experience or experience of God is. So I think that the atheist is really mistaken to kind of dismiss all of that experience simply based upon, very much the limited perspective of a small percentage of people. Maybe 5% of people globally would be atheists or something like that. So I think that's it seems to me a mistake.
Absolutely, and again, if that were the case, I don't think it would dismiss the rationality of belief in God anymore. That we say that it's normal, it's normative for human beings to see things, but then again, you do have blind people that don't see things. That doesn't deny the fact that human beings can see in general, or that seeing is something rational. We're not imagining what we see, right?
Exactly. There are a lot of good examples like that. Being colorblind, so not even fully blind, but being unable to distinguish blue and green. Right? There are many people like that in the general population. And we should not thereby reason that nobody can distinguish blue and green. So I'm a big fan of like a supernatural kind of movies that kind of explore the other side. And you'll often find movies that talk about like The Shining or The Sixth Sense or The Gift. These are all movies that talk about a particular character having the ability to see spirits or to interact with the spiritual realm. And that's another interesting question. It's like, could certain people have capacities to interact with the spirit realm, to see things that are not available to other people? Like you said, with vision, could some people be blind or colorblind and other people have vision? And I would just think when there's so much of that kind of experience, the wise position would be to not to say they're all irrational, but just to take the humble position. And I didn't find Matt and Tom doing that today.
Yeah, all right. So I mean, I completely agree with you on that. And let's move on to, for example, the discussion period, because that. Oh wait, before that, I did want to discuss Tom Jump's opening statement and the fact that he went through this list of things. So I was writing down what he said. First of all, he said there is no evidence for God's existence, so the other thing was that he accused most religious arguments or arguments, theistic arguments, I would say, of basically being a God of the gap approach, where you just try to fill in those gaps by imposing God. And third, invoking, of course, the fact that there are naturalistic explanations that somehow could explain away these things. So there are at least three arguments. And of course, he did mention that naturalistic explanations are better. I didn't quite, maybe he did, to be fair to him, but I didn't quite hear a justification as to why naturalistic explanations would be better, and by what standard is he comparing this betterness, and not to be presuppositional or anything like that, or to use their mantra. And then, of course, the claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which you kind of tackled. So maybe just go through with us, if you can, I mean, if possible, the opening statement from Tom Jump, and what you found interesting about it.
Yes, I first of all, the claim that there is no evidence at all for God's existence is just incredible. It shows to me the level of hubris, perhaps, like he's taken such an extreme position there that he can't just say, yeah, there is some evidence, but I don't find it sufficiently compelling. Whenever you find someone that takes a position like that there's no evidence at all for what is really not only the overwhelming position of people around the world, but also among academic philosophers and scientists, it's still very much a well-represented position among leading intellectuals. So, someone like Francis Collins, for example, former head of the National Institute of Health and of the Human Genome Project, brilliant guy and also a committed Christian. I referenced in the debate Axel Hollein, who's a friend of mine and also was on a team that won the Nobel Prize for Physics. People like that, they're smart, and they're also Christians. Another friend of mine, Don Page, teaches at the University of Alberta, and he was the doctoral student for Stephen Hawking in the late 1970s and has gone on to become himself a world-class scientist studying the origin of galaxies. So there's no shortage of intellectuals. And so when you say there's no evidence at all, well, I think that's just ridiculous. Now, Tom, as you pointed out, when he had his God of the Gaps argument, I think what he's just doing there is straw manning. I mean, they talked about steel manning at the end of the debate, but he's just straw manning all arguments for God's existence, claiming that they all have the same form and that they all proceed by plugging God into a gap in knowledge. And I'll just note one example where that's clearly false, and that's intelligent design. He referenced intelligent design theory. Well, the whole logic of intelligent design theory, if you actually want to steel man it, whether you agree with them or not, you have to appreciate the way they're trying to argue, is to argue that, at least let's say Stephen Meyer's version of it, because there are different versions, but on Meyer's version, you seek to explain current processes based upon known causes. So you don't invent new causes. And this actually comes from Charles Lyell, the famous 19th century geologist who said the present is the key to the past. So if you want to understand past processes, look to the present. And so actually, intelligent design theory for Stephen Meyer, he follows that principle and he says, okay, look at DNA. What are the known causes for that kind of organized information? And he argues over a 500-page book, Signature in the Cell, that the only known cause to provide that kind of specified information is intelligence. That is not an argument from a gap in knowledge. That is an argument from the kind of known causes we have for the effects that we are observing. So when Tom just caricatures and falsely describes all Christian or theistic arguments as God of the gaps arguments, he's just straw manning. But of course, it's impossible in a debate like that to respond to all of that. It's kind of like he's got this scattershot approach, and you can never go and pick up every pellet he's shot out, right? It's impossible.
Yeah, the shotgun approach, I think, is what they call that. Like you just spread out so many arguments at once. But I did find it really interesting that yeah, like you said, that he kind of like characterized all these arguments that were out there. But of course, we didn't. What was really interesting to me was that going back to what I said, is that he claims that the naturalistic explanations were better. I didn't. To be fair to him, maybe he did. I did not hear a justification for that as to why the naturalistic explanations were superior to them, because it's not as if it's natural. I mean, it's not as if we are talking about nature versus supernatural. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about belief in God. I mean, we all concede that nature is there. It'll be very different if I say that nature does not exist, only the supernatural exists, and then you demonstrate why the natural explanations are generally useful. So I don't know, but I didn't hear any justifications for that. I'm wondering if you did.
No, I did not. It seems to me, again, that Tom would just try to argue, well, where if the claims are mundane, then sort of if they're not extraordinary, then you don't need to appeal to science. But if they are extraordinary, then you need to appeal to science, and you need to have a testable hypothesis that predicts events, and only if it can predict events can you believe it if it's extraordinary. And I mean, one thing is that that's just arbitrary. I mean, where does he get that from? But another thing is it's also person relative. So extraordinary to whom? Well, extraordinary to Tom Jump. So this was something I tried to hammer on over and over again, is that I think both Tom and Matt were reading their own plausibility structure into a universal obligation for everybody to conform to scientific explanation when Tom and Matt think that they should be obliged to do so. And it's just arbitrary.
Indeed, yeah. So, yeah, I think that what we find is that there seems to be an assumption from their part that we should, as you said, to embrace the kind of skepticism that they have. Because, you see, I come from Malaysia, and it was interesting in this debate. I think for the first time in modern day debate, you actually had flags demonstrated there. Yeah, so yeah, there's a Canadian flag under your name, and there was a Malaysian flag in my name, under my name. And if you go to Malaysia, if you go to the east, where, by the way, more than half the world's population live, what we consider, and I think you kind of hinted at this, what we consider as extraordinary here in the West, in a secularistic context, would not be extraordinary there. I mean, things like ghosts. We actually, in Malaysia, this is really interesting. Those of you from Malaysia watching, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We even have a Hungry Ghost Festival where people all over in the streets put cakes, pink color cakes, on the road for the ghosts to eat. I mean, this happens. I'm not mocking them in any way, but I'm just saying that in the East, people believe in stuff like this, and it's to them it's nothing extraordinary at all. So when you use the word extraordinary, it seems to be, by whose standards are you talking about extraordinary? If you assume a naturalistic universe where nature is all that exists, and you bear no evidence for that, you refuse to give evidence to substantiate naturalism, then I guess that would be extraordinary for you. But why use your assumptions? I guess is your point. Why use your assumptions and impose that on the theist?
Yeah, I actually think that belief in ghosts is widespread, not just in the East, but throughout the world. So to note on with that, like the Day of the Dead festival in Mexico. And I actually looked at writing a book about ghosts around 10 years ago. And part of my preliminary research, I never ended up finishing it, but part of my preliminary research, I interviewed some people that I knew personally. I just put my feelers out and said, who's had experience with ghosts? And so I immediately found someone in my church that believed that she'd had an encounter with her grandmother after her grandmother passed away. And then I had a really interesting talk with Michael Licona. So you know Mike.
Yeah.
So Mike had an experience, a friend of his, where he was at a concert in the 1970s. Excuse me, Loggins and Messina, they were a popular duo in the 70s. And then I believe it was the friend of his, they were back from the concert, and then they, or somebody was at the concert. Okay, I actually wrote an article about this, so this is not a story of a friend of a friend. I actually documented it. But anyway, the story is he told it was that somebody died at this concert, and then either he or the other person that they saw a crisis apparition before that they knew that this person had died. And so those are actually what we call crisis apparitions, which is shortly after a person dies, you see the person before, like, you know that they've died, which veridically, in terms of if you're looking for evidence for disembodiment, then I mean, that's kind of interesting evidence to look for. Now, personally, I'm not staking a claim on the existence of ghosts either way. The Christian church has never, Catholics are big into ghosts, other Christians not so much, Protestants not so much. But the point is, yeah, that's part of the plausibility framework and interpretation of many people. So just to reject things because you think it's silly it's kind of like, you know, we'll go back to the East Asia analogy. You know, somebody from America or Canada that never traveled outside and thinks it's crazy to eat your food with 2 wooden sticks, right? Of course, you got to use a fork and a knife. And all that person is doing is showing their own provincialism, their own limited exposure to the world around them. And frankly, I think we got a little bit of that today.
Right. So let's move on to the discussion period, because that was where all the fun began. And I do want to highlight the point that so what I began doing is my approach I took a very gentle approach, and that's generally how I am. I took a very gentle approach. In fact, I've done a debate with Dr. David Wood on gentleness and respect in engaging non-believers. So again, this is something that that's characteristics of my approach in apologetics. But I took a very gentle approach in trying to open up Matt to basically get him to acknowledge that he himself has had experiences, religious experiences, I mean, and also that Tom has had religious experiences, and they both actually did not deny it. So my goal was actually to tell them, wait, I'm not asking you to believe on the basis of my religious experience. I'm saying that you have had religious experiences too, and what is your grounds for rejecting your experience, not mine? So, and that was actually my goal. But it kind of spiraled to aliens and all that from there, you know, because it didn't go in a straight line, as discussions like that never do. I think in a formal debate, you get that opportunity. But I was just wondering, what's your take on that? And in terms of their response to that.
Well, so I mean, I did appreciate their candor. I was actually impressed when you pursued that line of questioning, that Matt's candor of sharing his own personal narrative and so on. And I mean, it just kind of, to me, should raise the question to somebody, how do you know that you're right now and that you weren't right then, right? So maybe it's just a grounds to kind of rethink some of the assumptions that you've now concluded, because life isn't always a process of moving from ignorance to knowledge. Sometimes you kind of forget things you knew at one time. And I would also just comment as a general observation, I like to just kind of get in there and knock heads with people, and your approach to kind of to take a more of a bridge building and to kind of emphasize where you're agreeing with Matt and so on. I thought that was a nice compliment, and it's always I think that the saying from Dale Carnegie.
Right. I think you got muted there, Randall. I think for the last maybe 7 seconds ago, the moment you mentioned Dale Carnegie, you got muted. Could you just repeat that again? I'm really sorry, and I'm not sure if you're still muted.
Yeah, no,
No,
you
you're
can
not.
hear me now?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you now.
Yeah, so Dale Carnegie says, yeah, if you want to attract bees, you've got to use honey. So this sort of principle of winsome persuasion. So if you want to build a bridge with people and get them to be more likely to agree with you, find a way that you can agree with them, compliment them, find a point of agreement and commonality. And they thought you did that well.
Right. So thanks so much for that. But I wanted to get into the more feisty approach that you took, where you basically, your approach, it seemed to me, was to nail down any time you felt that they were unfairly shifting the burden of proof, or that anytime they demonstrated that the skepticism that we talked about even before this debate, is what what I think Braxton Hunter would call unbridled skepticism. Just share with us about your approach and why you decided to knock it straight away.
I'll just give a couple examples. So the one example where I thought they were quite inconsistent is with testimony. That on the one hand, they would concede at particular points, yes, we have to be able to form beliefs based upon testimony, because if you became a global skeptic of testimony, you would undercut almost all of the knowledge that you have now, because all of that knowledge traces back to formative years where parents and other caregivers were teaching you things and you just accepted and formed beliefs based upon their testimony. And if you now give a general skepticism about testimony, you undercut all their testimony that you've had and ever acquired back to those basic first moments. So that becomes a universal acid cutting through your justification or rationality for your beliefs. And they kind of would agree with that. And yet, I think they would also intuitively then recognize the implication is, well, then theism should be something that you could form a rational belief based upon testimony. And so that's where they would then back up and try to find different ways to deflect that and say, yeah, but that's an extraordinary belief and you need extra evidence for that. Tom would say you have to use science. And I mean, I think that they're just being inconsistent at that point. So I tried to hammer on that. And then the whole, I use the language of plausibility structure to point out that I think they have to recognize, I wish they would recognize that they're very much in the minority. So again, it's like if there were 5 million people who ate with fork and knife, and there's 5 billion people who ate with chopsticks, and then if the 5 million thought that the 5 billion are just irrational because they're eating with the wrong implements, you just want to kind of hammer home, you think that because of where you grew up and your limited cultural perspective. And I was trying to get them to appreciate that they're very much in the minority here. And to me, there's such a hubris, a conceit about being in perhaps 5% of the world population and thinking that everybody else is irrational. So I don't think I succeeded in getting them to see that point, but I certainly tried.
Absolutely, I think that I think towards the end, I think even Matt Dillahunty was able to appreciate that the fact that you were going head to head with him to challenge that. Though I don't think he appreciated it at that moment. It's an interesting point there, where he got quite heated himself. But for those of you watching who are, I mean, especially those of you who are watching who are atheists, I mean, I cannot stress this enough, how much of respect, at least I have, towards both Matt Dillahunty and Tom Jump. In fact, we love them. We appreciate all that they're doing. It's just that in the approach of debate, sometimes that you want to get to the point where you actually address some of these issues, because if you don't address it in a debate, where else would you address it? So that became one of the points that I thought really added a lot of spice to the debate. And we clearly, as you mentioned, Randal, Dr. Randal, we're using different approaches there to get around that. Now, I do want to talk before we close about the closing the Q&A session, which came at the end, because what I found really interesting is, and I'm not quite sure I fully understood, and I don't want to mischaracterize Matt's approach, but if I understood correctly, Matt in the end actually conceded that you can be rational in believing in God. Did you understand what he was saying? Because I don't want to misrepresent him.
He used the term reasonable and seemed to be using it in a way that he thought was not synonymous with rational, that it was somehow different. And so I was not, frankly, clear on the kind of distinction he was trying to make. I don't know if he was equivocating in some way or if I just failed to follow what he was trying to do. But it seemed to me that, again, he was trying, in a sense, to have his cake and eat it too. Like I think he was trying to do at other points in the debates. For example, admitting that you could be justified in accepting testimony to get to a restaurant, but somehow saying, but you could never be justified in holding testimony to believe in God. I tried to push back on I gave the example of Ellie Arroway, who has this experience where she thinks she's had a 9-hour experience with aliens, and this is in the film Contact, for those who are not familiar with it. And other people think it took 2 seconds, and so you've got this conflict here. But I said, well, if that was a particularly vivid experience, she could be justified in that. And that, I hope, was a dovetailing with your points about the diversity of religious experience that you cited from Swinburne, how those people could be justified. And I thought at certain moments that Matt was kind of saying, yeah, but at those moments, it was like he would pull back and say, but this isn't about that topic today. But then I wasn't clear what the topic was. So I think there was a little bit of a talking past one another, but overall, I thought it was a productive exchange.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt that it was a productive exchange. And yeah, there were times where in the discussion, I felt that, so I've seen Matt participate in lots of debates. I've been watching him for some time. And there are times where he gets really heated. And today clearly was not one of them, where even though he got heated, this was Matt in his really nice side. And I think that's compliments to the fact that you in particular, that even though there was this exchange, it was very well intended. There was no ill intent in trying to misrepresent him or to twist his words. But I think he got very passionate as well in defending his points. We were dealing with, Matt was talking about, there were times where I felt that he was kind of agreeing with me, but until the end, I need to say this, I didn't find any strong defeaters, which again, going back to my opening statement, I said, universality of religious experience, Matt and Tom affirmed that not just that other people have these experiences, that they too have had religious experience. Premise two was that in the absence of defeaters, you should go ahead and believe them. I was waiting for a long time for defeaters to come, and it seemed that the only hint of it early on was from Tom, where he kind of brought out this, I think what you would call scientism, right? Scientism. Maybe could you just expand on, I'm not sure if you already did in this review, but when you accused him of scientism, what did you have in mind?
So scientism takes science and puts an ism on the end, turns it into an ideology by saying that the only way to gain knowledge about the world is through science, or that the only kind of knowledge is scientific knowledge. And the reasoning people typically gravitate towards scientism is because science seems to be a uniquely productive way to understand nature. But of course, the fact that science understands nature doesn't mean science is the tool to understand morality or understand aesthetics or understand God or any range of other topics. I think that there's a common mistake there, that you end up saying, well, because it's successful here, it should be successful everywhere. And I think that is a mistake. And I think another point I made in the debate is that it's also self-refuting, because if you say all knowledge is scientific, well, of course, if you know that, then that's not scientific, right? It's a philosophical claim.
Right.
So you couldn't justify it by way of science. And so it's actually self-defeating. And that's why people who endorse scientism often kind of sense that tension, that they recognize if they come out and explicitly affirm it, then they're actually adopting a self-defeating position. And I think Tom experienced that tension.
Yeah, he clearly didn't. He didn't admit that he did hold to scientism. But sorry, I keep mispronouncing it. But we were talking also about, for example, people are talking about, can you test God? With physical experiments, you can actually go out and you can actually do the experiments. But I think there's a failure to recognize that when you're dealing with God, you're dealing with a person. See, when you're dealing with physical objects, you would find a sense of consistency and repeatability because they're objects, right? Under the right circumstances, water becomes ice. But you can't do that with a person who has the volition to choose whether or not he wants to reveal himself to you. And I was actually, I knew that the topic didn't warrant for it, but Matt has on many occasions said that, that if God wanted to show himself to him, he would. But I guess that due to how tightly we framed this our approach, I think it didn't give him room to actually bring out those kind of contentions that he usually raises. And so I only raised that to say that, well, I didn't see any major contentions or defeaters raised. The only one that was raised apart from what Tom did was this. Matt hinted at this inconsistency that was there in all these different different experiences of God. They're inconsistent. Some of them, talk about voodoo. Others talk about a personal God. Now, I've responded to that by saying that if you ask me, that actually affirms the credibility of those who are actually claiming they've had this experiences, because they're not copying from one another. But I was wondering whether you would respond any differently to that charge.
Well, yeah. So that's on the one end, I would kind of say, well, for the purposes of this debate, the question was just on, can you be rational to believe that there is this being God who is perfectly good, transcends nature, is the ground and cause of nature, and that human flourishing is tied to right relationship with that being? And if that's all that we're committed to arguing for the rationality of that, then there could be all sorts of other beliefs that people have about that being, and those don't provide a defeater, I don't think, for that basic commitment, because there could be all sorts of explanations for why people disagree about those various other things. For example, different cultural interpretations of the same data, or the fact that some people may be close to certain data that is, or that some may have limited data sets that God's revealed people to in different ways to different people. There's all sorts of possible interpretations of those diversity questions, and you could still justify the main claim that people could be rational to believe that God exists.
Absolutely. So that actually comes to the end of our review. Now this is again our perspective on it, and if you know anything about human nature, you would know that human beings tend to be biased, and we are no exception to that as well. Obviously, we are sharing it from our perspective on how the debate went. But I'd encourage you, if you haven't already gone and watched the debate, you can do so. I'll put a link to it on which the debate was in Modern Day Debate YouTube channel. If you haven't done so, I'll put a link to it, sorry, in the description box below, and you can basically go and view it for yourself. But before we go, a big thank you to Dr. Randal Rauser for your participation in this debate, and also agreeing to come on Explain Apologetics to do this. For those of us who are wondering how we can follow your work, especially I know you happen to be quite active on Twitter, is there any way that we can follow your work?
Yeah, so you can look me up. Okay, so you can look me up. I just got a little internet unstable sign, but you can look me up at my website, randalrauser.com. The spelling is right there on the screen, or you can look me up on Twitter as well if you search my name. And or I got some YouTube videos as well. So that's where you can find me. And have any questions, just let me know. And thanks a lot, Sam, for having me on. It was an honor to be with you and to do this. It was a lot of fun, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
I look forward to it, Dr. Randal. Thanks so much. And well, guys, that's it. So the links for Dr. Randal Rauser's channel, I'll put it in the description box below, and also his website. You can do that. Now, he's also written books that I will try and see if I can actually put that down below as well, that you can purchase from Amazon. I believe most of them have been published by Oxford University Press. Is that right?
No, I've got 12, I believe, out, and one of them was published by Oxford. I published with Baker and Intervarsity, Paternoster, Biblica, Edinburgh University Press, a few other presses. So I've been around. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you've certainly been around. I did want to ask you as well this, but I guess I'll skip it for another time about your denomination that you hold to. Or maybe you could just add one word in so that those of us who are listening to you from, I mean, wherever they know where you are coming from in terms of your denomination and commitment to Christianity.
I'm a part of the North American Baptist denomination. It's probably about 100,000 people in Canada and the United States. We have 2 denominational seminaries. I teach at one of those seminaries. I would also call myself probably a progressive evangelical. So that's where, yeah, so evangelical Protestant Baptist.
Absolutely. Once again, it's a joy and pleasure to have you with us. If you're new to Explain Apologetics, do consider hitting the subscribe button below. And on behalf of Dr. Randal Rauser and myself, Samuel Nesan, we hope that you've enjoyed this review and also the debate. And if you haven't quite watched it, once again, please do go and check it out. Until next time, it's been a joy being with you. Bye for now.